Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Political debate in Zimbabwe has often stalled over the issue of whether or not the opposition are competent. I have stated on this platform and many others that the primary reason why the people of Zimbabwe have risked everything to elect the MDC, Triple C, was for them to implement the democratic reforms. This arose out of the realization by the early 1990s that Zanu PF were corrupt, incompetent, and tyrannical. But as long as the party was able to rig the elections, the nation was stuck. They would not be able to remove Zanu PF from office. They could not make them accountable to the people. Because if you rig the elections, you're not accountable to the electorate. You'll be in power whether or not the electorate want it. So it was out of that that the people of Zimbabwe realized if they're going to have change in Zimbabwe, meaningful change in Zimbabwe, they need free, fair, and credible elections so that the people finally have a meaningful say in the governance of the country. If you understand that, then you understand why MDC itself, when Tsvangirai, the gentleman in the picture there, launched his party in 1999, they called it the Movement for Democratic Change. They were only riding on the popular demand for democratic change. They were promising the people of Zimbabwe, we will deliver you the democratic change. Some people have failed to understand what those democratic changes were. But basically, the democratic changes were to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections and restoring the people's fundamental freedoms and rights, including the right to free, fair, and credible elections. But we'll just focus on the right to free, fair, and credible elections, because that probably is the most immediate need that affected millions of people. So the MDC was a movement for democratic change. And indeed, ever since their launch, the party has had as at the heart of its slogan, change. So the question then is, what changes that the MDC and later on Triple C delivered in the last 24 years since the launch in 1999? And if you look at last year's elections, Zanu PF blatantly rigged those elections. A clear sign that whatever those democratic changes Tsvangirai and company had promised, they had not delivered them. There arises the problem. While some people will finally accept that yes, the democratic changes have not been implemented, they would not accept that the blame should be laid at the door of MDC or Triple C. I say they should. MDC had the golden opportunity to implement these democratic changes during the GNU of 2008 to 2013. Indeed, the primary reason for the GNU was to implement those democratic changes. The circumstances of the GNU itself point to that fact. The GNU was born out of the election in 2008, which the vote counting was interrupted by none other than Emerson Mnangagwa, who has been posting about it. It's not as if it's a secret. He's posted about it. He stopped the counting of the vote, told ZEC to stop announcing the results. He took over, he and his joke friends took over, and then they spent the next 6 weeks counting. There were only about 5 million votes. 6 weeks. And they were announcing the results in bits and drabs. You could see what they were doing there. And the most important result was Tsvangirai himself. When they finally declared the presidential results, Tsvangirai was reportedly leading Zanu PF's Robert Mugabe by 47% of the vote. Not enough to avoid a runoff. The Constitution of Zimbabwe said to avoid a runoff, one must win 50% of the vote plus one. So with 47, you couldn't avoid the runoff. And during the runoff, the country experienced some of the worst politically motivated election violence in its history. Over 500 people were killed. Millions of people were internally displaced because of the level of intimidation by Zanu PF operatives, the party militia, the war veterans, and the police, the army, and the CIO were involved. And they don't deny it. Indeed, those securocrats were handled by this Joint Operations Command, JOC, formed by Mugabe and Mnangagwa. And they were reporting at this time to Mnangagwa. And at the end of the day, before in fact the runoff vote was carried out, Tsvangirai was forced to withdraw because of the level of violence. He could not attend any rally to address his supporters. And most of his supporters were so intimidated that they were no longer attending any rallies. The result was so absurd that SADC, the AU, refused to recognize Mugabe as the winner. They would not grant him political legitimacy. And that is what forced him to join the global political agreement in 2008. And it was this global political agreement that gave birth to the government of national unity. Yes, I'll be the first one to admit that the government of national unity the power was not shared evenly between Mugabe's Zanu PF and Tsvangirai, two factions of MDC, one led by Tsvangirai himself, the other one by Welshman Mugabe. And at the time, initially, by Atham Tabara. But still, the opportunity to implement the democratic reforms that would have stopped the blatant cheating as happened in the March vote and the wanton violence as in the runoff. The opportunity to implement the democratic reforms were there. Why did the opposition fail to implement even one token reform in those 5 years? That has been the bone of contention. The honest, simple explanation for it is Mugabe bribed Morgan Tsvangirai and company, and they forgot about the reforms. This is not the first time Mugabe had bribed Zimbabwean leaders to forget about whatever their duty and responsibility to the people was. Mugabe had been doing this all along. Let's just listen to this video clip by in which Dr. Simba Makoni is being interviewed by Trevor Ngube, and he explains the genesis of Mugabe's bribe.
I recall very clearly that when we came into office in 1980, we inherited Ian Smith's systems. And Ian Smith's ministers drove Peugeot 504s. They drove themselves from home to work in their Land Rovers and all in kinds. Most of them were farmers. They parked their Land Rover and then they used the government vehicle when they were at work with a chauffeur. When they finished at night, they packed them and they took theirs to go home. Within the month of our coming into office, Prime Minister Mugabe then directed that every minister be issued with an E-class Mercedes-Benz. And the Peugeot 504s were retired to permanent secretaries, and the deputy ministers who then took over. We can also look at many other things, small they may appear at the time. Let me hazard that even at that point, Enos Nkala was our Minister of Finance. I don't think we knew what budget we inherited from Ian Smith when the decision was taken to buy those E-class fleets for the ministers. So the material affection for material things has always been with us. And the differentiation also, even going back into the camps, zve mashefu nezve macomrades makada were not the same. So much so that even today, when the so-called Minister for Presidential Affairs or Provincial Governor, as they were, goes to Bubi or Binga, they will be served separately and differently from the other people. The avarice grew as we began to exploit the opportunities of office. When I was in the government, the minister was allocated one vehicle that they kept, which was the sedan they used in town. If you needed to go off-road, then your ministry hired off-road vehicles from the CMED, and you were charged for it. Now a minister will have an average of 4 vehicles in his forecourt, all at government's expense.
So the leadership modeled the wrong kind of behavior, and that kind of behavior permeated all across our society. or CEOs, like you're saying, heads of parastatals and so forth, modeled from the top.
Indeed. Indeed. I made a passing reference that we have CEOs who will buy themselves a luxury car when they can't pay wages at the end of the week or end of the month. This has been so entrenched in our psyche, this showing off, as if you are a different person. You're breathing different air from those who don't drive Prados and Land Cruisers, from those who don't drive Jeep Cherokees. We have lost our humanity. There's lots of reference to Ubuntu, very farcical, superficial, not coming from the heart. We have changed. We have changed because of our appetite for power. And we have changed because of our avarice for material things. I think when we begin to associate a position of authority and responsibility with material well-being and acquisitions, that's when the rot set in. A Toyota Cressida isn't worth much compared to 6 kgs of gold and 15 billion worth of Marange diamonds and backhanders on contracts to pave 200 kilometers of roads. So when you ask, is there a moment? There is not one, but quite clearly, I think we began to change noticeably in the latter half of the 80s into the early 90s. Our character became preoccupied with power, with control, and with accumulation. That's where I would put the starting line.
What Dr. Makoni was explaining there is Mugabe, how Mugabe bribed his cabinet ministers and those in the party and so forth. And they forgot to carry out their duties as representative of the people, elected members of parliament, whatever it is. And this is why during the Kukura Wundi, for instance, not even one cabinet minister is on record to have questioned what Mugabe was doing. They didn't want to lose their privileged life. And Mugabe knew giving them these privileged vehicles, limousines, and generous salaries, and all this bought their blind allegiance to him. When Mugabe signed the GNU, the Global Political Agreement 2008, and Morgan Tsvangirai and company joined the government, Mugabe saw to it that Morgan Tsvangirai and company were denied nothing. They got the same E-class limousines, the same generous salaries if they were ministers or deputy ministers. And for Morgan Tsvangirai himself, the $4 million mansion in Highlands. Of course, they forgot about the reforms. With their snouts in the feeding trough, they forgot about the reforms. Why some people find that difficult to swallow is their problem. They have got faith in the individual leader or the party. They are allegiance to the leader or the party is more stronger than acknowledging the mountain of evidence that the leaders, MDC leaders, sold out during the GNU. It is tragic, of course, because human beings are supposed to be a creature of reason. But when you start surrendering the truth, facts, reality, because you do not want to acknowledge that Tsvangirai was corrupt and incompetent, even with all the evidence before you. It's tragic. The truth of the matter is, throughout the 5 years of the GNU, MDC leaders failed to implement even one token reform. Zanu PF cronies themselves were boasting about it. If you ask them, why is MDC leaders not implementing reforms? They openly admitted, MDC they've tested the good life of the gravy train. They're not going to rock the boat. Why the nation should fail to make progress on this issue of the MDC leaders, Triple C leaders, are corrupt and incompetent. And therefore, then we need to look for leaders who will be faithful to that initial commitment of democratic change. Beggars belief. 24 years after MDC leaders were on the political stage, there is not even one token reform implemented. And worse than that, ever since the GNU, MDC leaders have participated in these flawed elections, knowing fully well that the process is flawed, knowing fully well that by participating, they are giving Zanu PF legitimacy. But they've continued to participate because they also knew that Zanu PF was giving a few gravy train seats for those who participate and win those few gravy train seats. Mugabe was cunning and clever in that regard. He realized that as long as the opposition are allowed to win a few gravy train seats, they will participate in these flawed elections no matter what. That is exactly what these MDC leaders have been doing. It beggars belief how anyone can deny that Chamisa's claim last year, for instance, that he has plugged all the vote rigging loopholes was just utter nonsense. How could he have plugged all the vote rigging loopholes when you do not even have a verified voters roll? And come election day itself, he failed to deploy election agencies at all the polling stations, although he had received the funding for it. This was an individual who knew Zanu PF will win these elections. Zanu PF is rigging them, and there's no point in pretending that he can do anything to stop it. He just wanted to participate so that his friends win the available gravy train seats and makes him the leader of the opposition. And his friends will win the gravy train seats. They can enjoy the benefits of those gravy train seats. What he didn't know, of course, is that other Triple C members had their own plans as well. So as soon as the election results were declared, and those few who had been declared as the winners of Triple C seats had taken up their seats in parliament, before they'd even warmed them up, Tsvangirai started recalling them, saying they were no longer members of Triple C. Chamisa could not stop Tsvangirai because the party itself was utter chaos. There was no real party. Triple C was just Chamisa and himself, and appointed a few others around him. There was no constitution. There was no party structure. There were no elected leaders. So anyone could declare themselves Secretary General. And that is exactly what happened. And hence this chaos. How anyone can continue to pretend that Triple C is going to save the country beggars belief. But it all emanates from this inability to accept, particularly during the GNU, that MDC leaders sold out. Man is a creature of reason. But when you stop accepting facts, reality, truth, I think you're committing the equivalent of suicide. You're denying your very own humanity. You're no longer a creature of reason. You're denying your own humanity. Zimbabwe is at serious risk of being conned into participating in the 2028 elections without even a single reform implemented, and people participating in their millions as they did in 2023, and thus making 2028 a replica of 2023, as 2023 was a repeat of 2018. We need to stop this madness of participating in flawed elections to give Zanu PF legitimacy, only to perpetuate our own suffering. The opposition leaders themselves, they are quite content with sharing the spoils of power in the form of the few gravity seats that they get. It is the ordinary Zimbabweans who are gaining absolutely nothing from this, except perpetuating their own suffering. That, to me, is pure insanity. When are we going to stop this insanity? That is the number one issue that should be occupying every thinking Zimbabwean out there. Thank you very much for listening, and have a good day or good night wherever you are in the world. Thank you again.